So I'm on a quest to memorize as many old classic chess games as I can, and we're going to look at a spectacular game between Adolf Anderssen and Jean Dufresne, which was played in 1852. And you may have heard of it. It's called the Evergreen Game, and we'll talk more about that name a little later. So let's have a look. So it was a king's pawn opening, and Anderssen played bishop c4 here, the Italian game. And Dufresne responded bishop c5, the Gioco piano. And Anderssen played the gambit b4, known as the Evans Gambit. And this brings us back to the Romantic era of chess, where we were always gambiting pawns back in the 1800s. We were playing for piece activity, strong attacks, and nobody really cared about material that much. All right, so what's the point of this move b4? Well, the point is to draw the bishop off of this strong diagonal and to get it away from controlling d4, and then try to get a strong center and develop our pieces very quickly. So Dufresne responded by capturing the pawn. It's the best way to play this gambit. And then comes the move c3 to hit the bishop, gaining time. The bishop falls back to a5, and then Anderssen pushes in the center. A lot of people say the move c3 supports that pawn at d4. And it does in many openings, but not really in this opening because the pawn on c3 is pinned. So why does white play like this? Well, I wondered that myself for a long time. I didn't really like it. This opening looks good so far until you see black's next move, and you realize white can't recapture. I think the real point of c3 and this whole line of play isn't to support a strong center, which you know you're going to lose immediately, but rather it's to open up the diagonal here for the queen and to just get your pieces out as quickly as possible while that bishop has been diverted over to the sidelines. Okay. In fact, in this particular opening, white sometimes sacrifices more than just the initial gambit pawn. There are lines where he sacrifices 2 or even 3 pawns for piece activity. Anyway, seeing that the pawn on c3 is pinned, white continued by castling to unpin it, threatening to take and get the strong center. Okay, in this position, Dufresne played a very rare move that you wouldn't see today called d3. And it's interesting that the Lichess database actually refers to that move as the Dufresne defense because of this game, I suppose. It's not considered very strong because black just used one of his very important moves, one of his tempi in this game, to push another pawn. Should be developing. He should get this knight out and castle as quickly as possible. The strength of the Evans Gambit for white is that he gets his pieces into play very quickly and attacks the uncastled king. I can see the point of this move though, d3. It's to fix this pawn on c3 here to stop the knight from developing to its natural square. And black also hopes white will waste some time recapturing that pawn. But white doesn't recapture the pawn now immediately because the pawn really isn't a threat. He can recapture it at any time. So instead he plays queen to b3, forming a battery here against f7. Okay, and black's got to protect the f7 square. He does it with the move queen to f6. He doesn't want to do it with the knight over here, protecting that square, because the knight would just be taken, and then the f7 pawn would be won on the next move. So he has to do it with the queen, and he decides to place it on f6. Okay. White attacks the queen with e5, expanding in the center. This becomes a powerful pawn in the position. For one thing, it opened up a square here on e4, which this knight on b1 might be headed to later in the game. And for another thing, that pawn on e5 makes it difficult for black to push his d pawn and get developed. Okay, black slid the queen over, keeping an eye on f7. You may wonder, why doesn't black take the pawn? It's only guarded once here. Well, the problem with taking it is this move rook to e1 pins it, threatens to win it, and the only way it can be guarded is with this move d6. But that drops a piece to queen to a4, forking the king and bishop. Okay, so that's why black can't take that pawn on e5. So he slides the queen over, and then white rather takes the time to develop his rook to e1. Not sure that's the best move to place your rook behind your pawn here. You don't really have an intent to push your pawn to e6 and open this file. So maybe that rook belonged on d1, threatening the d3 pawn, so that when white takes that pawn with the bishop, it would be attacking the queen. Okay, but I can't really criticize. Rook to e1 looks fine. It's developing rook to a central file. Okay, black takes the time to develop his knight here. Good idea. It's got to get castled as quickly as possible. And then white develops his bishop to a3. That's a very typical move in the Evans Gambit. Putting your bishop on a3 pressures a piece on e7. Or if there's no piece on e7 at all, excuse me, delete that move. If there's no piece on e7 at all, then the bishop on a3 often serves to keep black from castling. Okay, in this case, we're pressuring the knight on e7. Okay, after bishop to a3, black plays kind of a radical move here. He plays b5, sacrificing a pawn, intending to develop his queenside quickly. I think everybody says here that black should have just castled. If black wants to develop their queenside efficiently, perhaps this is a good plan, and then b5 hitting the bishop, gaining time for a fianchetto. Okay, but I still would castle first. Okay. But b5 was played. White takes the pawn that was offered. You don't want to take it with the bishop and get your bishop pinned with rook to b8. So you take it with the queen, and then rook to b8 is the point of giving up the pawn. You want to activate your rook with tempo, and you also have this diagonal open for your bishop. Now white drops the queen back to a4. And white's actually threatening something in this position. Black's pieces are a little precarious. This bishop on a5 is guarded by the c6 knight. The knight on e7 is also guarded by the c6 knight. This c6 knight is known as an overloaded piece. It's doing too much. It has two jobs, keeping an eye on both of these. So for example, black could make a mistake here. He can ignore that fact that that's overloaded. Luckily, black did not overlook that fact, and he moved his bishop out of the way so it wasn't under attack anymore. But he might have made a mistake and castled. If you castle, then white can take this knight and is up a piece, because if black recaptures, we get this bishop. Okay, so that was a little tactical threat white had. So black removes his bishop from that pressure from the queen. Okay, after that, white develops his knight to d2. Looks like an excellent move to me. It's heading for e4. This rook is now available to come into the game. Although I find it funny, when I looked at this with an engine, the engine prefers to move queen to d1 by far. I don't know, that looks terrible to me. What would you rather do? Put a piece back on its original square, or develop a piece off of its original square? Not to mention open another piece up for development. I know it's not that simple. You have to take into account the concrete nature of the position, but optically knight to d2 looks much better to me, and that's what was played. Okay, after knight to d2, black still doesn't castle when he should. He plays bishop to b7. Okay, it's a good place for the bishop. It's eyeing this kind of weakened g2 square here, or weak g2 square that the queen is also pointed at. There's a couple knights on that diagonal. If they moved out of the way, we'd have a mate threat here on g2. So it's a good place for the bishop, but I think castling was in order first. Okay, then white continued developing his knight to the center of the board where he wanted that piece. Good reason that pawn moved from e4 to e5 earlier. And now black makes a completely inexplicable move. I did a little bit of research online and I didn't really see anybody explaining why black made this move. But he played queen to f5 here, which doesn't make any threat. It's not on a better square. It was really good on this file here pointed at the king, especially in conjunction with that bishop, as we said earlier. So why does he move it to f5? Especially considering he knew white was planning on taking that pawn, which he does in the next move, and he puts the bishop right in line with the queen. Okay, so I can't really explain that. And black has to move the queen again because white is threatening knight to f6 check, which will win the queen with a discovery. And he does. He moves the queen again to h5. So he just did this little triangle dance here, wasting time. Okay, after queen to h5, white makes a pretty controversial move here. He plays knight to f6 check, which is a royal fork. It looks like white's sacking his knight, okay, but he's not, because after black took the knight and white recaptured the pawn, we realize, well, black's knight is pinned by the rook. And so white can regain his knight at any time. So it's not really a piece sacrifice. But why is this move so controversial? Well, after that sequence, take a look at the position. Black just gained this open G file for his rook. So who's really doing the attacking in this game? If black gets that rook to g8, queen takes f3 becomes a threat. Both of these bishops are pointed very nicely toward the white king. So now the position is double-edged. Not too sure who would win here with perfect play. So what should white have done? Well, it's pretty complicated, but white shouldn't have opened up the G file, it seems. One possible line I noticed given by the engine is to harass the black queen with knight to g3. And then the only safe square for the queen is here on h6. Every other square is covered. And then strangely, the engine prefers bishop c1, putting a piece back on its original square to attack the queen. Queen goes here, it's the only safe square. So that queen was under some pressure. And then there's this strange recommendation by the engine, knight to h5, putting the knight on the rim. Okay, but it is doing something. It's attacking the g7 pawn, threatening that check there. And it makes it very hard for black to develop. For example, black can't really castle in this position. Can't really harass the knight either with g6 because the white knight hops firmly into f6 here. And he can't castle because of this nice tactic. Bishop takes h7 check, and if the king takes the bishop, then we have this royal fork. We win the game. Not that fork, but this fork. We win the game. So black wouldn't be able to take that bishop. He'd have to slide over to h8. But then the move queen to h4 is very strong, putting that queen in line with that king. And the attack is too strong, and white's going to win. Okay. So after this kind of forcing sequence, forcing the black queen to e6 and then posting the knight on h5, black is kind of stuck, and white is in command in this position, and that might have been the best way to proceed. I'm sure there were other ways to proceed as well. But white didn't retreat his knight and attack the queen. He went for the fireworks here with knight to f6, as we saw. These got exchanged. And now black plays probably correctly with rook to g8, putting pressure right here on g2. And that bishop, remember, is still eyeing g2. Not only that, black just made a threat against the knight on f3 because the pawn on g2 is pinned. So black's pressing here. White doesn't want to recapture his knight like this now. For one thing, the black king would be very safe behind this pawn. Sometimes you can hide behind an enemy pawn, which can block the enemy pieces from getting in. That would be terrible because of queen takes f3 with a mate threat on g2, and pushing to g3 doesn't do you any good. We have this sacrifice. Okay, and then if we take back with the queen, and notice this pawn is pinned. Okay, and this knight's about to move out of the way, and that bishop and that queen are going to kill you. Okay, so you really cannot take that knight right now. So what do you do about this threat? Well, here comes a very famous move that Anderssen played. Okay. Rook A to d1, addressing the threat against his knight on f3, strangely enough. Okay. When that move was played, it was a jolt. It was astounding. People described it as amazing. When Steinitz analyzed this game years after it was played, right after Anderssen had died, Steinitz analyzed this game as a tribute to Anderssen. And after his 19th move, rook A to d1, the annotation Steinitz gave was an evergreen in the laurel crown of the departed chess hero. An evergreen in the laurel crown. So in other words, Steinitz was saying that this move and this game would last forever. And it's standing the test of time. It's over a century and a half old, and people are still admiring it and playing through it and learning from it. So what's the idea with this move? Well, it's very deep. You could say it's kind of a Morphy move because all of these white pieces are developed and they're participating in a possible attack against this uncastled king. And that's the only piece that isn't developed. So why not put it on a central file here? And now you got everything participating in an attack against the king. Okay. But you have to be more concrete than that when you make such a move. You can't just say, I'm making a developing move here, it looks good. Because black has a big threat. Queen takes f3. Well, it turns out after rook to d1, black could have defended this position and the game could have gone on. But he would have had to find a miraculous engine-like line to do it. Black didn't save the game. He made the human move here. You almost can't resist it. He played queen takes f3. I mean, why not? You get a knight, you threaten mate. It's not much else to be done with your king here in the center of the board. You can't castle it. Both your rooks have moved. So maybe black's just waiting for the coming storm, wants to see what's going to happen. Okay, well, that's the move that white expected black to make when he moved his rook to d1. And he had planned this move here. Rook takes e7 check. Now, black could have lasted a little longer than he did in the game. The move he made in the game was knight takes rook. Okay, he Could have lasted a little longer by moving the king over, but the attack would have continued with rook takes d7 check, and it's not possible to take the rook because of a double check, and the attack is going to end in a mate. So black would have moved his king over here to c8, and then I'll let you think about this. White has this miraculous move, rook to d8 check. Okay, and I'll let you ponder the tactics there, but it has something to do with this queen on f3 and whether or not black can keep it. Okay, so black could have lasted longer than he did after rook takes e7, although white has a winning position no matter what at this point. But black played knight takes e7, and now white has a forced mate with a great Morphy-like queen sacrifice. Queen takes d7 check. Okay. You got to accept it. You go over here, you just get mated. So you take the queen. That allows a double check. But which one? Here or here? So pause the video, maybe think about it. Which one is the winning double check? Okay, the winning double check is bishop to f5. Then either the king moves back to his back rank or he moves up here, and then he gets mated with bishop to d7. Beautiful mate right there. Okay, so he's got to move back if he doesn't want that mate. And that's the only move, only other move. White continued, Anderssen continued with bishop to d7 check. And there are two moves with the king. Dufresne chose there, and Anderssen mated him. If the king chose there, he would have been mated as well. Okay, so that was the end of the game. Beautiful game. Well worth my time to memorize that one and to look at some of the tactics involved. I learned a lot. I hope you enjoyed the game too. Thanks for watching.